Good evening, everyone. I am so honored to be here, and of course also to be sharing the stage with the esteemed Paul Krugman. And it's ironic that I'm here with you tonight to tell you about why I am so excited about cryptocurrency and the technology surrounding it. And it's ironic because in 2012, that was the first time I had ever heard of the word Bitcoin. And I was a federal prosecutor with the United States Department of Justice at that time. And I was asked to prepare a case against Bitcoin. Well, the more I did some diligence and looked into it, I found that some of the myths I'd been hearing were just not true. And the more I worked in this space, I started to realize that this new technology was actually something that could really revolutionize the way we do things. I find myself discussing cryptocurrency all of the time with a variety of different audiences. And in discussing with some of those audience members after, I hear the same myths over and over. And so I wanted to take tonight to talk about 3 myths that I hear routinely and dispel some of them. Let's take a look at what the 3 are. There are 3 common ones. First, that cryptocurrency is anonymous and only used by criminals. Second, that aside from speculation, there's no use for cryptocurrency. And third, that crypto is just about currency. So let's take each of those in turn and see if I can persuade some of you. Maybe some of you are already persuaded that those are myths, but maybe some of you aren't. And I'd like to try and do that tonight. So thank you so much for having me. The first myth we see and we hear it all the time, is that cryptocurrency is anonymous and criminal. And certainly when I was at the Justice Department, this is what I heard about Bitcoin in 2012 and 2013. The truth is that any technology worth adopting is often first adopted by criminals. It turns out criminals are great beta testers of new products and new technologies. If criminals aren't using your product, you might have a flaw in your product. In fact, think about the early days of the internet. Although all of us in this room now use the internet every day for almost everything, in the earliest days of the internet, some of its earliest adopters were fraudsters, pornographers, and just criminals. And Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and associated technologies are no exception to the rule that some of the earliest adopters will be criminal elements. And I'm not going to stand here tonight and tell you there's no fraud in cryptocurrency. I'm not going to tell you no criminals use it, because of course that's not true. Criminals and fraudsters use every kind of technology we have. Whether you're talking about cell phones, internet, anything, really anything goes. But the fact of the matter is that criminals are no longer the biggest consumers of cryptocurrency. And some people find this surprising, but if you look up here, at its peak in 2012, 30% of Bitcoin transaction volume, 30%, was associated with darknet markets, marketplaces like Silk Road or Alphabet. And we typically, of course, associate darknet markets with criminal activity. But by 2018, that number is down to 1%. Now, why is that? This comes from a company called Chainalysis, who works with governments around the world tracking cryptocurrency. Why is it? Because more and more ordinary people are starting to buy, use, and yes, speculate about cryptocurrency. Ordinary people like doctors, teachers, engineers, farmers, lots of my students and plenty of other students, and guess what? Even a lot of people who work for the government. So ordinary people are increasingly using, for a number of different reasons, cryptocurrencies. Now, you might ask, why is the criminal component not larger? And that's one of the things I wondered when I was working in the space prosecuting some of the earliest cryptocurrency criminal cases. And what I learned from prosecuting, I put some of the earliest Bitcoin criminals in jail, as a matter of fact. And one of the things I learned is that if you wanted to cover your tracks and you were a good criminal, Bitcoin or cryptocurrency is one of the last things you should use. And that's surprising to most people. Why is that? Well, unlike cash, which is anonymous, cryptocurrency is not anonymous. Let's dispel that myth right here. I'm going to prove it to you tonight. It's not anonymous, it's pseudonymous, and those are two very different things. Now, how do I know this? Well, many of you have probably heard of Silk Road, and it was being run by Ross Ulbricht in San Francisco. And someone was trying to extort Ross Ulbricht of millions and millions of dollars. It turned out the person who was doing the extorting was at that time a US federal agent. And he thought since he was using cryptocurrency that he was anonymous and he would never be caught. He specifically didn't use banks and fiat currency, but he used cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. Well, what you see up here is Exhibit A to our case, our indictment. When we traced, and this was back in the pretty early days of cryptocurrency, this wasn't last year, this was years ago, and we traced those patterns of Bitcoin, the anonymous Bitcoin that's actually not anonymous, right back to him. Here's another exhibit from that case showing some other transactions. And then there was another individual who stole $150 million worth of Bitcoin from darknet vendors. He thought, well, they're not going to report the crime. They're criminals themselves. And I'll steal this and I won't be caught because Bitcoin, it's anonymous. We prosecuted him too. Here's the trace we did that led right to him. I'm not going to tell you this was easy, but it was a lot easier than had I had to subpoena overseas bank fiat accounts or Western Union records, which I spent over a decade doing. Instead, we were able to go online. And this was some government lawyers and government agents. It's not like we had technical backgrounds or really knew much about the technology at this time. We were able to go right online and trace this through the blockchain. And that's pretty remarkable. And I can tell you all tonight, had cryptocurrency not been used in that case, we would have never caught these individuals. And they would have still been working for the government instead of in prison, which is where they are today. Then there was the Russian cyber criminal that we prosecuted. He stole over $100 million, actually hundreds of millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin from Mt. Gox, you might have heard of, the Japanese cryptocurrency exchange that went under when it was hacked. He thought anonymous and he would make a few transfers to what he thought were anonymous wallets. That headline shows you up there, but he was caught too, and he's now awaiting extradition to the United States. Even special counsel Robert Mueller's team. Robert Mueller, of course, is leading the investigation in the US into Russian interference in the election. And even Robert Mueller's team just traced Bitcoin. Bitcoin payments that Russian GRU intelligence officials are alleged to have made. The headline on that is right up there too. And it's not, governments aren't alone in being able to trace this. Of course, the governments have subpoena power, so they have an easier time marrying real-world identities with the blockchain wallet addresses. But there are now entire businesses coming up, being built around being able to trace cryptocurrency, not only Bitcoin, but countless others. Companies like Chainalysis or Elliptic, or just a couple of the ones I mentioned, tell them that cryptocurrency is anonymous, and they'll show you something like this. They trace cryptocurrency every day for governments around the world and for financial institutions. I predict that with machine learning, that this is even going to become easier to trace, as machines are going to be able to get smart about who owns what wallets and make connections that no human possibly could. So next time someone tells you crypto's anonymous, keep these things in the back of your mind. Now, critics will also say, well, cryptocurrency, that's just going to let money laundering flourish. Money launderers love cryptocurrency. That's the familiar refrain I hear over and over again. Well, I spent a decade prosecuting money laundering crimes in the trenches. I prosecuted the biggest online money laundering case in the US in history. Okay? And I can tell you that fiat currency is working just fine for those guys. In fact, it's working so fine that 99, this is staggering, I didn't even know this until a couple years ago, 99.9% of money laundering crimes with fiat currency succeed, despite the $20 billion annually that financial institutions put toward anti-money laundering compliance. I testified before the US Senate last year on money laundering. The US wants to modernize its money laundering laws, and I got to go testify. And at that hearing, one of the Treasury officials and a senator pointed out in response to this number, so we're just 1 decimal point away from total failure. And we've all seen these headlines about financial institutions with fiat currency failing to catch very massive and obvious money laundering schemes right under their noses. Despite all of that $20 billion spent to fight money laundering, it's not working. And by the way, these banks are subject to anti-money laundering laws. Guess who else are subject to anti-money laundering laws? Cryptocurrency exchanges. In almost every country, that's not just in the United States, but of the countries that allow cryptocurrency exchanges to exist, most also extend their money laundering laws to cryptocurrency. In fact, the director of FinCEN at the US Treasury, she's retired now, but I remember a speech she gave that said, actually, some of the digital currency exchanges file the best suspicious activity reports we've ever seen. The banks, they go fill in the blank, and we can't really do much with it. But some of those digital currency exchanges, they do a great job on flagging suspicious activity. I'm not going to sit here and tell you money laundering doesn't happen with cryptocurrency. Of course it does, but it happens far greater with fiat currency. A lot of government agencies view the blockchains, when they hear there are blockchains in play, they view those as a treasure trove of evidence. My former colleague recently told me he calls it digital breadcrumbs. So that's on the money laundering. The next criticism or myth that I often hear is that aside from speculation, there's just no use for cryptocurrency. It's just a big bubble, just speculators. And for the first thing, for the finance types and the economists in the house tonight, speculation is a loaded term. After all, what about the farmer, the wheat farmer, who wants to hedge against the price of her wheat 6 months hence? She needs a speculator to take the other side of the trade. But even aside from that, there are plenty of other use cases today going on that do not involve speculation, but that involve cryptocurrency. And I want to talk about 3 of them tonight. One is hyperinflation. Critics, and mostly, a lot of times these critics are in the United States. They say, regular money works just fine. We don't need cryptocurrency. Dollars seem to work fine, our banks work fine. Well, why don't you ask the 80 million people right now in Turkey, or the 44 million people right now in Argentina, or the 32 million people in Venezuela if they think their money and banks are working just fine. And I think they will tell you that is not the case at all. And in these countries where hyperinflation is taking root and currencies are being inflated 10, 20, 200, 2,000%, and pensioners are losing their entire life savings, cryptocurrency is one of the areas that they're getting into, not because they want to, but because they don't have an alternative if they want to keep their life savings. This slide I always love. This is the $100 trillion bill from Zimbabwe. I don't think money is working just fine there. And what about it? It's not just Zimbabwe, Greece, Brazil. But the most startling example that we are seeing right here, not very far from us, is Venezuela. And Venezuela, it's amazing what's going on there now. A 41,000% price rise this year, where a family, very sad, was literally throwing away huge bushels and baskets and garbage cans of money for the garbage, because that's what they were, garbage, worthless, not worth the price to store. And you see up here, that's why you see in Venezuela images like here. This is at the Banco de Venezuela. You see pensioners, and you also see some young folks in there. They're standing in line, trying to get their fiat money out before it loses more value, and they are looking for places to put it. And one of the areas they are turning to is cryptocurrency. In fact, localbitcoins.com, a very large exchange, 10% of their volume right now, today, is in Venezuela. That's billions of dollars. Sorry to keep referencing dollars, but I tried to do the conversion in bolivars, and it's practically impossible. A new 100,000 bolivar note is today worth 50 cents in the US. And that was the new note that was printed. We're also seeing an increase among cryptocurrency use, not speculation, use, among the unbanked. 2 billion people in the world are unbanked, and not everyone has access to bank accounts. In fact, this summer, I got to spend some time with Roya Mahoob. She's one of Time's most influential 100 people in the world. You can look her up, her story's incredible. She's an Afghan woman she was the entrepreneur who started a tech company in Afghanistan that employed female software engineers. And a few years ago, she went to pay them, she told me. But she found out that 99% of them didn't have a bank account and couldn't accept payment due to cultural prohibitions. Because if their male relatives found out, it would be immediately confiscated. So what did she do a few years ago? She started paying them in Bitcoin. If you believe the current system that we have is meeting the needs of the world's disenfranchised and unbanked, then you can probably go ahead and dismiss cryptocurrency. But if you believe that it would add value to the global economy to get cheap, fast, and easy access for 2 billion people in the world, then cryptocurrency is something that you ought to pay attention to. Speaking of the disenfranchised, what about international remittances? Actually, it's interesting, $600 billion of international remittances happen each year. And when I say remittances, I don't mean businesses, right? I just mean individuals sending money home. You might all already know this, but the US-Mexico corridor is the biggest international remittance market route in the world. And every year, $24 billion is sent on that route by people, individuals. And despite the technological advances of the last decade, transferring money from the US to Mexico remains slow, inefficient, and really expensive, as anyone in this room who's ever tried to transfer money to another country knows. I mean, I was thinking about it, it's kind of crazy that in 2018, it's easier, cheaper, and faster for me to get on a plane in San Francisco and fly to the Philippines with a bag full of cash than to wire it or use a remittance. Now, don't try that at home because it's also against the law. But the point is, it shouldn't be that slow. And it shouldn't cost that much. Well, an agent, like a Western Union, takes the money, then they have their bank. Then their bank has their cross-border bank. Then it has to get to the agent on the other side's bank. Then it finally gets to the agent who can disperse it. Guess what? All of these middlemen along the way take a hefty cut, and it also slows things down. Did you know that in the world, on average, these middlemen take 7.5% for most country pairs, on average? That's on average. And that means that $30 billion a year are what consumers are paying to these middlemen. Banks, MoneyGram, Western Union. $30 billion of people who can least afford it, by the way. Right? These are people mostly who are working hard to send money home. Guess what it is in Southern Africa? 30%. Let me show you this statistic up here. 100 miles away, 2 neighboring countries, Angola and Namibia. You have a farmer who wants to send equivalent of 100 US dollars. Guess how much his family gets? 70. Guess how much the middlemen get? 30. And look at the circuitous route it follows. It goes to Johannesburg, and then it goes up to London, to correspondent banks, all the way back down to South Africa. What sense does that make? Cryptocurrency, combined with cheap mobile phones and fast internet, are letting companies like Abra, like BitPeso, like Bitso here in Mexico, and like Circle, they're allowing settlement to happen without correspondent banks. And now, customers in 155 different countries with 54 currency pairs can use cryptocurrency to transfer remittances that we otherwise have to go through that convoluted process that I just described to you. In fact, the CEO of Bitso, the founder and CEO of Bitso here in Mexico, told me that last year, in Bitcoin payments alone, not all cryptocurrency, just Bitcoin, He processed 16 million Bitcoin coming between the US and Mexico. And that number might seem small now, but my point is it's on the rise. People are starting to realize that this is a possibility. So next time you hear that it's just speculation or a bubble, I want you to realize these are real people who are working really hard, and all they're trying to do is not get rich quick. They're just trying to keep some of their hard-earned money in their pockets and not give it away to middlemen. This is just individuals. We haven't even talked about the $18 trillion in cross-border payments that businesses do. Lots of market opportunity there. And cryptocurrency is being explored there too. A company in San Francisco named Veeam is doing a lot there. The customers don't even necessarily need to know that crypto is what's settling the trades. They just know they get paid faster and it costs them less. Now this is the early days, but I predict that one day sending a cross-border payment is going to be like the equivalent, or an international remittance is going to be like the equivalent of going to Western Union to send a telegram instead of sending an email from your phone. We don't have cross-border email, so why are we having cross-border payments? And cryptocurrency is helping there. Final use case I want to highlight tonight is there's a real product market fit for cryptocurrency like Bitcoin as a store of value, a digital gold, if you will. And this is where I'm sure Mr. Krugman is going to have a lot to say about gold. People ascribe value to all kinds of things. Over time, they've ascribed value to beads, to seashells, to gold. And some things like gold have an inherent value. But some things don't seem to have much inherent value. Look at the stones up on the screen here. These are called rye stones. And they're used still today by the Yap people in Micronesia. They've been used for centuries in Micronesia as a store of value. Now, does anyone here consider these stones particularly valuable? Something has value if a community of people believe that it has value. And that's starting to happen with Bitcoin. Well, I want to tell you about the 6 attributes that typical stores of value will have. First, scarce. There's not a lot of it. Second, durable. Doesn't require a lot to keep up or repair. Third, it's divisible into smaller pieces. Fourth, it's verifiable, easy to tell fakes from the real thing. Fifth, it's portable and easy to carry. And sixth, it's fungible. So gold's been the standard bearer of the store of value for centuries. And right now its market cap is, does anyone know? $7.5 trillion is the market cap of gold. Now, I know it makes for nice jewelry. I like gold myself. And some dental fillings, I guess, but does that justify a value of $7.5 trillion? Few people realize that in the 1970s, gold lost 30% of its value. It's also hard to divide. It's possible, but hard. And is definitely not moved or stored very easily. As Germany found out last year, Germany tried to repatriate last year, or did repatriate last year, 50,000 gold bars worth $30 billion. Weighed 700 tons. Know how much that cost to ship? It also took 4 years. So is that a great store of value? Now consider Bitcoin. Let's look at our store of value checklist. Bitcoin's scarce. Only 21 million will ever be created. It's durable because it's online, so you don't need to repair it. It's divisible. Many don't realize you can divide up a Bitcoin. You don't need to own a whole Bitcoin. So you can divide it easily and cheaply and instantly. It's also verifiable because of the blockchain. There's no such thing as a fake Bitcoin. And it's portable because it's digital. It's also fungible in theory, although there are some differences around this. One Bitcoin should be worth the same as another Bitcoin. Now, skeptics, and I guess there are some around here tonight, skeptics will point to the volatility of Bitcoin. And they're right to point to Bitcoin's volatility. We've all been paying attention to the news. Bitcoin's price has been up and down last year, of course. But the point I want to make to you is that Bitcoin celebrates its 10-year birthday this year. It's been around 10 years. And the longer it's been around, the less volatile it's become. Now, relative to gold, it's definitely easier to send, to store, and to carry and transport. There's no question there. And many of the things we value in the physical realm, people are getting used to digital forms. Look at photo albums. I mean, if you love touching your photo albums, now Probably keep them digitally. Books, the same thing. Music, similarly. So I ask you, is it so hard to imagine that, especially among young people are growing up with only digital things, it feels like. Is it that hard to imagine that a store of value would also go digital? Turning this, a gold vault, right into this, a Bitcoin mining. Now, I'll be the first to admit that the first generation of cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin and others, they're slow, they're clunky, they're hard to understand. And look, there's way more need for architecture and infrastructure, and also for less volatility. But that's where things like stablecoins come into play. And that's where things like more energy efficient consensus mechanisms come into play, and scaling and architecture generally. And let me tell you that now in my new position as a venture capitalist, I see teams every week coming from engineering teams, coming from Google, or developer teams coming from Facebook, people coming from research universities all over the world to meet with us, to tell us about the projects in these categories they're building right now. So why would we assume that the innovation is all just going to stop today? And as more institutional money comes into the space, this ecosystem is going to continue to grow up even more. Now let me get to the third and last myth of the night. And that is with the term cryptocurrency itself. I just don't even almost like that term, because it implies that crypto is just about currency, when it's not. It's about so much more than that. And when I realized how much more it was than just currency, that was kind of when I had my aha moment and decided to kind of move into this space full time. Now, let me illustrate what I mean about this. If Alice and Bob didn't know each other, we used to need a trusted intermediary. Like, let's say they wanted to change value. Well, we needed someone to broker that trade. Maybe it was a bank or maybe another service. But when blockchain, the technology underlying Bitcoin, came along, all of a sudden, we no longer necessarily need a third-party intermediary. Why? Because the blockchain is a shared, permanent, immutable database. Cryptography protects its contents, so it's really hard to alter or damage. And it creates this single automated record that everyone in the world can use. And the reason why this is important, let me go back and revisit Bitcoin here for a second. Go back to our trusted intermediary. It replaces the trusted intermediary with the blockchain. Now, to make this even easier to understand, think about PayPal or you could use any service, a bank, Venmo, PayPal. I picked PayPal as an example. PayPal is a trusted intermediary, and it lets Alice pay Bob. And PayPal is a centralized company with employees, and they're incentivized to make their service work. They're incentivized because the central service of PayPal pays them a salary. That's why they keep working on the projects that allow value to be transferred from Alice to Bob. Well, there's a similar incentive structure in blockchain. Who services the blockchain? Bitcoin code is run on computers all over the world, but it's not done for free. Those people have to have some incentive to provide this service and keep the network running. That's where Bitcoin comes in. That's the incentive. They're paid Bitcoin to perform that service. That's why I never understand. And now, if anyone ever tells you, oh, I love blockchain, I always hear business people tell me this, not always, but sometimes, I love blockchain, but I hate Bitcoin. Well, you know what? Blockchain doesn't work without Bitcoin, because you need an economic incentive to keep that network running and those services up. And those people are incentivized to run, but the technology, and here's the exciting part, the technology that's at the heart of all of this system, we've been talking about payments. But you could replace central intermediaries for all kinds of products and services. Because of course, the contract from Alice to pay Bob is just a simple contract. Imagine all of the decentralized products and services you could have. But why would we want decentralized products and services? I mean, after all, today we have Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google. But are we so crazy about some of these things? They control all the rules. They have all the users. They have all of the power. So maybe you don't like the way Facebook is selling your data. What if an independent developer could build a better, more user-friendly Facebook? He can't now compete. Or I should say, before crypto networks, he couldn't compete. Why? Facebook has all the users. They've got all of the developers. They have all of the resources. So an independent developer is not incentivized to do that because he can't make a project scale. And he might also be a single developer. Right now, we have these giants. The other problem with having the giants is that they actually stifle innovation for the reason I just mentioned. You have a lot of talented, independent, third-party developers out there who want to build products that might make everyone better off. It would be a more rich internet, but they're not incented to do that, and they just can't compete. Now enter crypto networks. Crypto networks are a combination of the blockchain plus tokens. In the case of Bitcoin, the blockchain, it was Bitcoin, the currency. And there you get crypto networks. The tokens are what are incentivizing people, developers and users. And here's the really important part about crypto networks. We're not talking about a single developer or the developers he or she might know, or a single user, or a small community. Because crypto networks, remember this technology is global and has no borders. All of a sudden, crypto networks take what was just happening with a single developer who wanted to try and compete with a centralized platform and scale it to the world. And incentivized. At scale, some of these groups could potentially start to take on some of the big, huge giants if they build better products and services. And users would be incentivized because of the tokens. Developers would be incentivized because of the tokens. But the really exciting thing is, we don't even know what other behaviors might be enabled by crypto networks. After all, the original inventors of the internet had no idea that behaviors would be enabled, like shopping on Amazon or binge watching on Netflix movies. So who knows what is going to come of this? And that's why people are very excited about this space. You see some of the statistics up there. 10% of global GDP will be built on blockchain apps in 10 years. That statistic comes from the United Nations and from the World Bank. 42% of the world's top 50 universities now offer at least one cryptocurrency class, and 84% of major companies are incorporating blockchain technology. In conclusion, a horse and buggy, in the early days of the earliest automobiles, people who were buying some of the early cars were being asked, why do you need the car? The horse and buggy work just fine. And those early cars were really slow. But people who wanted to have cars needed infrastructure like roads and services like gas stations in order for cars to truly take off. The same thing happened, and we know how that ended. And the same thing happened with the internet in 1995. You used to see this old school computer. Imagine, or 1994, 1995, imagine if on that day I would have told you, hey, fast forward, you're going to have a small device in your pocket. You'll be able to download a 2-hour movie, watch it on demand, shop for groceries, interact for free with all of your friends and family, call them for free on Skype, find an apartment anywhere in the world, summon a ride on demand. You would have told me I was crazy, rightfully so, because you would have pointed out my modem can't stay connected long enough to get out a single email. The same is true of crypto. We are in the dial-up days. And the critics out there confuse the current state of innovation with the end state of the innovation. And I think that's one of their biggest mistakes. Why would they assume the innovation would all stop right now? I mean, complaining about crypto today, one journalist said, and complaining about how slow and how it works today is like complaining in 1994 that the internet didn't have Netflix. Now, it's obviously a real honor to be up here, even mentioned in the same sentence, with a Nobel Prize-winning economist. Paul Krugman revolutionized the way we think about trade theory, and he won the Nobel Prize for that. And in his 2008 Nobel Prize lecture, he said he emphasized the importance of exploring what he called strongly special cases, even if they seem silly. In fact, he said one of his principles was dare to be silly. And I would encourage you all here tonight, let me do just a full round look at everyone. I encourage everyone in this room to do that tonight, to challenge some of the conventional wisdom and the assumptions that you're being told. And imagine the compelling special cases that I discussed tonight. And ask, is this conventional wisdom right? Or are these just myths? And thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, so I am going to do this without slides, partly because I wanted to be able to respond to Catherine, who gave, I think, that's the best defense of crypto that I've heard. So congratulations. I'm not going to agree, as you might guess.